A detective stands in a quiet field outside Glasgow. Beside him, a calm man points at the ground and tells him, almost gently, that the missing girl is right there, that he is standing on her now. He was telling the truth. That man was one of the worst Scotland has ever produced, and yet only one name on a much longer list. Glasgow is known around the world as a warm, friendly, big-hearted place. It is also the setting for some of the most disturbing cases in British history, stretching back over 150 years. And the horror is only half of it. Underneath these cases runs the same pattern again and again. Innocent men locked away for things they never did. A figure who was never caught and never named. Ordinary-looking people hiding terrible secrets in plain sight. Across this video, we will go through all 10 in order, from a Victorian scandal that shocked the world to a tragedy from only a few years ago. Section 1. The Lady of Blytheswood Square. In the Glasgow of the 1850s, the city was rich, proud, and almost fanatical about respectability. It was the second city of the British Empire, full of new money from shipbuilding, trade, and engineering. The families who had that money cared deeply about how they looked to everyone else. A good name was worth more than gold, and a single scandal could finish you for good. This was the world Madeline Smith was born into, and it is the world that turned her into the most talked-about woman in Scotland. Madeline arrived in 1835 as the daughter of one of Glasgow's well-off families. Her father was a successful architect, and her grandfather was one of the most respected builders the city had ever produced. They lived at a grand address, 7 Blytheswood Square, and kept a country house out near Helensburgh as well. As a teenager, Madeline had been sent off to a finishing school in London, the kind of place that taught a young lady exactly how to behave in polite company. On paper, her whole life was already mapped out. She would marry well, run a respectable home, and never give anyone a reason to gossip. Then, in 1855, she met a man named Pierre-Émile Langelier. He was nothing like the husband her parents had in mind. Langelier had come to Glasgow from the Channel Islands and worked as a clerk on a modest wage. He was about 10 years older than her, charming, romantic, and far more ambitious than his small income allowed. The two of them began a secret relationship, passing letters back and forth and meeting when they could without being seen. Those letters would later sit at the very centre of the whole affair, because Madeline wrote them with an openness that stunned the people who later read them aloud in a courtroom. She spoke about her feelings and her private life in a way that respectable Victorian women were simply never meant to. For roughly 2 years, the relationship carried on in the shadows. Her family, though, had bigger plans for her. They found her a much more suitable match in a wealthier man named William Minnock, and in January of 1857, she agreed to marry him. That left her with a dangerous problem. Her old letters to Langelier still existed, and they were full of words that could wreck her engagement and her reputation the moment anyone saw them. Madeline asked Langelier to hand the letters back. He refused. Worse, he warned her that he would show them to her father and her new fiancé. For a young woman in her position, that was a trap with no easy way out. Around this same time, Madeline walked into a chemist's shop and bought arsenic. She bought it more than once, signing the register each time, and she told people it was for her skin. Using tiny amounts of arsenic for the complexion was actually a known habit in those days, so by itself the purchase proved nothing. The timing of it, however, would come to mean everything. On the morning of the 23rd of March, 1857, Langelier became suddenly and violently ill and lost his life. The cause was arsenic. He had been lodging in Glasgow, and once he was gone, the police searched his rooms. There they found Madeline's letters. The instant they understood who had written them, and the instant they learned she had been buying arsenic, suspicion landed squarely on her. She was taken into custody at the end of March and charged in connection with his death. The trial opened on the 30th of June 1857 at the High Court in Edinburgh, and it became a national sensation. Newspapers across Britain and far beyond printed every detail. Crowds gathered outside the court, desperate for a seat. Here was a pretty, well-bred young woman from a fine family accused of ending the life of her secret lover, with her most private letters read out for the whole country to hear. Victorian society was equal parts horrified and gripped, which is the exact reason the case has never faded. Prosecutors argued that Madeleine had an obvious reason to want Langelier gone, that she had bought the arsenic and that he had taken it in a hot drink. Her defence hit back hard. Her lawyer reminded the court that all of the evidence was circumstantial and that nobody had actually seen her give him anything. The chemists who had sold the arsenic explained that they normally mixed it with colouring so it could not be used in secret, and no such colouring was found in Langelier's body. The defence also pointed out that Langelier was known to take arsenic himself, which raised the possibility that he had taken it on his own. After 9 days, the jury delivered a verdict that perfectly captures the whole story. In Scotland, there is a third option alongside guilty and not guilty. It is called not proven. It means the jury was not convinced the accused was innocent, but the evidence was not strong enough to find them guilty either. That is the verdict Madeleine Smith was given. She walked out of that court a free woman, never punished, yet never truly cleared in the minds of the public. She went on to live a remarkably long life and did not pass away until 1928, more than 70 years after the trial. And still, the question that hung over her in that courtroom has never been answered. Did she do it, or did she not? Nobody can say for sure, and that single piece of doubt is exactly why her name remains one of the most famous in the history of Scottish crime. Madeleine Smith was accused of acting in secret, and the law could never quite pin it on her. A few years later, in the very same city, another well-known figure would do something strikingly similar, only far more openly and far more coldly. He hid it behind the one job that everyone in Victorian Britain was raised to trust without a second thought, and the people who trusted him most had no idea what he truly was. Section 2. The Doctor of Sauchiehall Street. Step into Glasgow in the 1860s and you would find a city that placed enormous faith in its doctors. Medicine was becoming a respected profession, and a family doctor was treated as a man of learning, someone you welcomed into your home and trusted with the lives of the people closest to you. That trust is the key to understanding Edward William Pritchard, because everything he did from behind it. Pritchard was not a Glasgow man by birth. He was born in the south of England in 1825, the son of a naval captain, and he trained in medicine before moving north. By the time he settled in Glasgow, he had built up the image of a respectable, charming family doctor. To the outside world, he looked like exactly the sort of gentleman you would trust with your health. Behind closed doors, he was something else entirely. He set up home with his wife, Mary Jane, and their children at 131 Sauchiehall Street, one of the busy main streets of the city. The marriage looked perfectly fine from the outside. The reality was that Pritchard had begun a relationship with a young servant in the household, a woman named Mary MacLeod. He made her promises, and one of them was the kind no married man should ever make. He is said to have told her that, if his wife were ever gone, he would marry her instead. In the early months of 1865, Mary Jane began to fall ill. Her symptoms were strange and severe, and they came and went in a pattern that did not match any ordinary sickness. Whenever she went away to stay with family, she seemed to recover. Whenever she came back to Sauchiehall Street and to her husband's care, she grew worse again. Pritchard treated her himself, playing the role of the devoted husband at her bedside, while secretly feeding her tiny amounts of harmful substances mixed into her food and drink. One of them was a chemical called antimony, given in small doses over time, so that her decline would look natural. Mary Jane's mother, Jane Taylor, came to stay so she could help nurse her daughter back to health. It was a fatal decision. Mrs. Taylor ate some of the same food prepared for her daughter, and in late February of 1865, she became gravely ill and passed away. Pritchard, calm as ever, signed her death certificate himself and wrote down a cause that hid the truth. A few weeks later, in the middle of March, his wife passed away too. She was only 38 years old. What happened next is the detail that has kept this story alive. At the funeral, Pritchard asked for his wife's coffin to be opened so that he could kiss her one last time, weeping in front of the mourners. He could summon tears whenever he pleased, and this talent for fake grief later earned him a chilling nickname. People began to call him the human crocodile, after the old idea of crocodile tears. The act might have worked, except for one problem. Another doctor had been brought in to examine Mary Jane near the end, and he had refused to sign off on her passing because he did not believe the official explanation. Shortly afterwards, the authorities received an anonymous letter that pointed straight at Pritchard. That letter is widely believed to have come from the very doctor who had been suspicious all along. The remains were examined, harmful substances were found, and the gentle family doctor of Sauchiehall Street was arrested. His trial took place at the High Court in Edinburgh in July of 1865 and lasted 5 days. The evidence against him was overwhelming. The servant, Mary MacLeod, admitted, reluctantly, to her relationship with him. The medical experts laid out exactly what had been discovered after the two women passed. Pritchard tried to shift the blame, even hinting that others were involved, but the jury saw through it. They found him guilty. In the days before his execution, Pritchard finally stopped lying. He admitted that he was responsible for both deaths and confessed that he could give no real reason for what he had done beyond a kind of madness and the heavy drinking he had sunk into. There was no grand scheme, no clever plan that made any sense. He had simply ended the lives of his wife and her mother because they had become inconvenient to the life he wanted. On the 28th of July, 1865, Edward William Pritchard was executed on Glasgow Green. A vast crowd gathered to watch, packed in tight from the early hours of the morning. It was the last time an execution would ever be carried out in public in Glasgow, which made the day historic for reasons that had nothing to do with the man himself. Like Madeline Smith before him, Pritchard became one of those cases that Glasgow would talk about for generations, a name that stood for something dark hiding behind a respectable face. The difference between the two of them is simple but important. Madeline Smith was never proven to have done anything at all. Pritchard confessed in full. The law looked at the evidence, reached the right answer, and acted on it. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. The law, though, does not always get it right. Decades later, an elderly woman would lose her life inside her own Glasgow home, a quiet flat filled with jewellery, and the police would arrest a man who almost certainly had nothing to do with it. It would take nearly 20 years and one of the most famous storytellers in the entire world before anyone came close to uncovering the truth about what really happened on that cold winter evening. Section 3. The Wrong Man. By the early years of the 20th century, Glasgow had a police force under serious pressure to look modern, efficient, and able to solve big cases fast. That pressure matters here because the story of Oscar Slater is not really the story of a guilty man. It is the story of what happens when the people in charge want a result so badly that they stop caring whether it is the right one. It began on the evening of the 21st of December, 1908. Marion Gilchrist was an 82-year-old woman who lived in a comfortable first-floor flat at 15 Queen's Terrace on West Princes Street in the West End of the city. She lived quietly with a single young maid, Helen Lambie. Miss Gilchrist was wealthy and a little unusual. She kept a large and valuable collection of jewellery hidden away in her home, something very few people knew about. On that December evening, just after 7 o'clock, Helen Lambie went out to run a couple of short errands and left her elderly employer alone for only a matter of minutes. In those few minutes, someone got into the flat and attacked Miss Gilchrist. She did not survive. When Helen came back, the alarm was raised and the terrible scene inside the flat was discovered. Two things about that scene stood out at once. The first was that there was no sign of a break-in. Nothing had been forced. That strongly suggested Miss Gilchrist had let her attacker in herself, which pointed to someone she knew, or at least someone she did not fear. The second was that, despite all that hidden jewellery, only a single item was missing. One crescent-shaped diamond brooch had been taken, and nothing else. The police needed a suspect, and they soon picked one. His name was Oscar Slater, a 36-year-old German immigrant who had arrived in Glasgow only weeks earlier. Slater was Jewish, foreign, and earned his money by gambling, though he sometimes told people he was a dentist or a dealer in jewels. He lived under a false name with a female companion, and not long after the crime, he had pawned a diamond brooch. To officers chasing a quick answer, he looked perfect. There was just one problem, and it was enormous. The police checked, and within about a week they knew the truth. The brooch Slater had pawned was not the brooch taken from Miss Gilchrist's flat. Hers had a single row of diamonds. His had 3 rows. They were 2 completely different pieces of jewellery, and Slater had pawned his before Miss Gilchrist ever lost her life. The one solid link between this man and the crime had simply collapsed. By that point, though, Slater had already set off for America. He had arranged the trip well in advance, and it had nothing to do with Glasgow. But to a police force desperate for a culprit, a foreign man leaving the country looked like guilt. They went after him across the Atlantic. Slater was so certain he had done nothing wrong that he agreed to come back on his own to clear his name. He should never have trusted the process. Before the witnesses identified him in America, they were allowed to see him first, which made any identification close to worthless. At his trial at the High Court in Edinburgh in 1909, the case against him was thin and rested mostly on shaky witness accounts. There was no real evidence linking him to the flat. Even so, the jury convicted him by a majority, and he was sentenced to death. Just days before he was due to be executed, his sentence was changed to life behind bars. He was sent to Peterhead Prison in the far north of Scotland, and there he stayed, year after year, for a crime almost everyone involved had reason to doubt. Slater might have rotted there forgotten, if not for the people who refused to let the case die. A Glasgow detective named John Thompson Trench, a decorated officer, became convinced that the wrong man had been locked up and that the real attacker was someone connected to Miss Gilchrist herself. When Trench spoke out and claimed evidence had been hidden, he was thrown off the police force for it. Questions were raised in Parliament, a journalist took the whole affair apart in a book, and one man dragged the case into the spotlight of the entire world. That man was Arthur Conan Doyle, the creator of Sherlock Holmes. Doyle examined the case the way his famous detective would have, picking apart the weak evidence and arguing again and again that Slater was innocent. He kept at it for years. At one point, Slater even managed to smuggle a hidden message out of prison to reach him, a desperate plea from a man running out of hope. In the end, the pressure paid off. In 1927, after nearly 20 years locked away, Oscar Slater was released. The following year, in 1928, his conviction was officially overturned on the grounds that the trial judge had misled the jury. Slater was given £6,000 as compensation for the years that had been stolen from him. In the eyes of the law, he should never have been convicted in the first place. What makes the case so haunting is that nobody was ever truly held to account for what happened to Marion Gilchrist. The real attacker was never named. An innocent man lost almost 2 decades of his life. The true culprit walked free, and it took one of the most famous writers in the world stepping in just to get close to the truth. Slater walked out of prison, cleared and compensated. But not everyone caught up in Glasgow's dark history was so fortunate or so innocent. A few years later, a woman would be executed inside a Glasgow prison for a crime so cold that it shocked the whole country. She would become the first woman to face that fate in the city in 70 years, and the very last woman in all of Scotland. Section 4. The cart on the road. Up to this point, the people in this story have had money and standing. A doctor, an architect's daughter, a wealthy old lady in a fine flat. Susan Newell came from the complete opposite end of life, and her story is one of poverty, desperation, and a single act that could never really be explained. Susan was born in 1893 in Oban, on the west coast of Scotland, into a family that had very little. Life was hard from the start. Her first husband was lost during the First World War, leaving her a young widow. She later married a man named John Newell, who worked on the Glasgow subway, and the couple settled in Coatbridge, a tough industrial town just east of Glasgow. Susan had a young daughter named Janet. Money was always tight, and by the summer of 1923, the family was struggling badly. The other person at the centre of this story was a boy named John Johnston. He was 13 years old and worked delivering newspapers, the kind of ordinary working child you would have seen on every street in Scotland back then. On a June day in 1923, John was out doing his round when he called at the Newell home. He never came back. Inside that house, in a way that was never fully understood, John Johnston lost his life. There was no robbery worth the name. The boy had only a few pennies on him. There was no long-running grudge, no plan, nothing that worked as a reason. Whatever happened seems to have happened suddenly, in a single terrible moment, and then it was over. What Susan Newell did next is the part that turned the case into a national sensation. She needed to get rid of the evidence, so she wrapped the boy in a quilt, loaded the bundle onto an old handcart, and began pushing it through the streets. She was heading out of Coatbridge in the direction of Glasgow, several miles away, as though she could simply walk the problem out of her life. It was a desperate, almost unbelievable thing to attempt, and it was never going to work. As she pushed the cart along the road, people began to notice. The heavy, oddly shaped bundle under the quilt did not look right, and word spread fast. When she was stopped and the quilt was lifted, the truth was impossible to hide. She was arrested within days. Her husband, John, was also taken in at first, but he was able to prove he had been staying elsewhere after a family argument, and he was cleared. There was one more devastating detail. Susan's own young daughter, Janet, would later tell the court that she had come home from playing outside and seen her mother wrapping up the boy. A child giving evidence against her own mother in a case like this is the kind of thing people never forget, and it sat heavily on everyone in that courtroom. The trial took place at the High Court in Glasgow in September of 1923. Susan's defence argued that she was not of sound mind and could not be held fully responsible. The jury did not accept it. They found her guilty, though they did add a recommendation for mercy, clearly uneasy about where the verdict was heading. Under the law of the time, there was only one sentence available for her crime, and the judge had no choice but to hand it down. Susan Newell was sentenced to die. A real effort was made to save her. There was public sympathy, partly because she was a poor woman who had been left with nothing, and partly because the country had not put a woman to death in a very long time. Petitions were sent to the authorities, but the man with the power to step in, the Secretary of State for Scotland, refused to change the sentence. He decided the law had to be applied exactly as it stood. On the 10th of October 1923, Susan Newell was executed inside Duke Street Prison in Glasgow. By all accounts, she stayed calm and composed right to the end, and in a final act of defiance, she refused to let her face be covered. Her name went into the history books for a reason that had nothing to do with the boy or the cart. She was the first woman to be put to death in Glasgow in around 70 years, and she became the last woman ever to be executed in the whole of Scotland. No woman has faced that fate in the country since. That is the strange weight this case carries. It was not a clever crime or a riddle that baffled detectives for decades. It was caught almost at once, solved almost at once, and the why behind it was never truly answered. What stays with you is the image of a desperate woman pushing a cart down a Coatbridge road, a 13-year-old paperboy who simply went to the wrong door, and the fact that Scotland would never execute a woman again. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. Susan Newell's crime was sudden, messy, and over in a matter of moments. But the Glasgow area was about to meet something far more frightening. 3 decades later, a man would arrive who did not lose his temper in one terrible instant, but who took life again and again, coldly and on purpose, across 2 long years. For a time, he would make an entire region too afraid to leave the house once the sun went down. Section 5. The Beast of Birkenshaw. For most of the cases so far, there has been a reason somewhere underneath the horror. Money, jealousy, desperation. Peter Manuel is where that pattern breaks. He is the point in Glasgow's story where you stop asking why, because there is no answer that makes any sense. He took lives because he wanted to, and for 2 years he turned the towns around Glasgow into a place where ordinary people were genuinely afraid of the dark. Manuel was born in New York in 1927 to Scottish parents, and the family moved back to Scotland while he was still a child. Trouble followed him from an early age. He had his first conviction for breaking into houses at just 12 years old. By his teens, he had moved on to attacking people, and as a young man, he was sent to prison for years for a serious assault on a woman. By the time he was 30, he had a long criminal history behind him, and he had learned how to lie, how to charm, and how to talk his way out of trouble. His worst period began in 1956 and ran to the start of 1958, mostly across Lanarkshire, the cluster of towns just outside Glasgow. The crimes were chilling because of how random and how cold they were. In January of 1956, a 17-year-old girl named Anne Nealons lost her life near a golf course in East Kilbride. Manuel was questioned, but at the time there was not enough to charge him, and his own father gave him an alibi. Later that year came something far worse. Manuel got into a house in the Rutherglen area while the family slept, and 3 people lost their lives in a single night. A woman named Marion Watt, her teenage daughter Vivian, and Marion's sister Margaret. The husband and father, William Watt, had been away on a fishing trip when it happened. Here the story takes a turn that should feel familiar by now. The police fixed on the wrong man. William Watt, an innocent and grieving husband, was arrested and held in Barlinnie prison for 67 days for something he had nothing to do with, while the real culprit was still free and still dangerous. Manuel was actually locked up for a stretch during this time on a separate break-in charge, which paused the danger. But when he was released near the end of 1957, the crimes started again and came faster. A 17-year-old named Isabel Cook disappeared in December while on her way to meet her boyfriend. For a long time, her family had no idea what had become of her. Then, around New Year of 1958, Manuel struck for the final time. He entered the home of the Smart family in Uddingston and ended the lives of everyone inside: Peter Smart, his wife Doris, and their young son Michael, who was only 10 years old. What he did next is one of the most disturbing parts of the whole case. He did not flee. He stayed in the house for days, helping himself to food and money, and then drove off in the family's car as if nothing had happened. That car and that money were what finally caught him. Manuel began spending banknotes that could be traced back to the Smart family, and the trail led the police straight to his door. He was arrested in January of 1958. What followed was almost as strange as the crimes themselves. Manuel confessed in detail to a string of these acts, and he even led detectives to a field and told them, calmly, that Isabel Cook was buried right beneath where he was standing. He was right. Yet once his trial began, he changed his story completely, took back his confessions, and claimed the police had forced them out of him. His trial took place at the High Court in Glasgow in May of 1958. Partway through it, Manuel made an extraordinary decision. He fired his own lawyers and chose to defend himself, becoming the first person in Scottish history to do that in a case of this kind. It went badly for him. He seemed to know far too much about the details of the crimes for an innocent man, and the more he talked, the worse he looked. The jury needed only a couple of hours to find him guilty of 7 of the deaths. Peter Manuel was sentenced to death. His appeal failed, and on the 11th of July 1958, he was executed inside Barlinnie Prison in Glasgow. He was one of the last people ever put to death there. Almost nobody mourned him. Across Lanarkshire and Glasgow, families who had spent 2 years locking their doors and watching over their children could finally breathe again. What makes Manuel sit so heavily in Scotland's memory is the sheer absence of meaning behind it all. He did not do it for money or revenge. He did it coldly, over and over, to strangers and to families asleep in their own homes. And he seemed to enjoy the attention his crimes brought him more than anything else. He is often described as the closest thing Scotland has ever produced to a monster in human form. And after everything he did, that is hard to argue with. Manuel was caught in the end, and the law made absolutely certain he would never harm anyone again. About 10 years later, though, Glasgow would face a completely different kind of fear. A man would meet women at one of the city's most famous dance halls, walk out with them into the night, and then disappear without ever being identified. More than 50 years on, nobody can say for certain who he really was. Section 6. Bible John. Every city has one case that never closes, one name that still makes people lower their voices. For Glasgow, that name is Bible John. He is the man the city never caught, the stranger who walked into one of its most famous buildings, walked back out into the night, and was never seen for who he really was. More than half a century later, his identity is still a mystery, and that mystery is the exact reason he has never been forgotten. To understand the story, you have to understand the Barrowland Ballroom. In the late 1960s, the Barrowland was one of the most popular dance halls in Glasgow, a huge, lively place in the East End where people went on a Friday or Saturday night to dance, have a drink, and meet someone new. It was loud, crowded, and full of life. It was also the place where a quiet, well-dressed man would meet 3 women who never made it home. The first was Patricia Docker. In February of 1968, the 25-year-old nurse went out for a night at the Barrowland. The next morning, she was found a short distance from her own home, and it was clear that someone had attacked her. The case shocked the area, but there were few clues and no obvious suspect, and the trail soon went cold. More than a year later, it happened again. In August of 1969, a 32-year-old mother of 3 named Jemima MacDonald spent the evening dancing at the Barrowland. A couple of days afterwards, her own sister found her in a derelict building nearby. She had been attacked and had lost her life. 2 women, both last seen at the same dance hall, both found close to home. People in the East End began to feel that something was very wrong. Then came the case that gave him his name. In October of 1969, Helen Puttock, a 29-year-old, went to the Barrowland with her sister Jean. At the end of the night, the 2 sisters shared a taxi with a man Helen had met inside. During that journey, Jean sat right beside him and listened to him talk. He came across as polite and well-spoken, but he also started talking about religion, quoting lines from the Bible, and at one point he mentioned that his name was John. Jean was dropped off first. Helen stayed in the taxi with him, and the next morning she was found near her home. She had not survived the night. That taxi ride changed everything, because it left behind a living witness. Jean had spent a long time sitting next to the man, in the light, close enough to remember his face, his voice, his clothes, and the strange things he said. From her account, the police put together a detailed description and a now famous drawing of the suspect. He was described as tall, smartly dressed, soft-spoken, with reddish hair cut short in a neat, almost military style. The press took the religious talk and the name from the taxi and turned it into the chilling nickname that stuck forever: Bible John. What followed was one of the biggest police investigations Scotland had ever seen. Officers were convinced the same man was responsible for all 3 cases, and the hunt was enormous. They checked military records, thinking his haircut and manner pointed to a forces background. They interviewed hundreds of barbers across the city, hoping someone would recognise a regular customer who matched the description. They chased lead after lead, and after all of it, they came away with nothing solid. No arrest, no charge, no name they could prove. The years passed and Bible John became part of Glasgow folklore, a ghost story with a horrible basis in fact. Suspects came and went. In the 1990s, the case took a dramatic turn when the police focused on a man named John Irvine McInnes, who had died some years earlier. They went as far as reopening his grave to test his DNA against evidence kept from one of the cases. The results were not clear enough to prove anything, and McInnes was neither confirmed nor ruled out. Even in recent years, the case refuses to die. In 2023, a BBC podcast took a fresh look at the whole story, put the focus back on the 3 women whose lives were taken, and raised new questions about how the original investigation had been handled. It suggested that the identity of the man in the taxi may have been quietly kept out of the official records, and it pointed once again toward John Irvine McInnes. The programme stirred up enough interest that the police confirmed they would look at the claims again. But to this day, there has been no proof and no certainty. That is what makes Bible John different from nearly every other case in this story. Manuel was caught and made to answer for what he did. Pritchard confessed. Even the men wrongly accused were eventually cleared. Bible John was never caught, never named for sure, and never made to answer for anything at all. 3 women went out for a normal night of dancing and never came home, and the man responsible may have lived out his entire life as someone's quiet neighbour, never once suspected by the people around him. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. Bible John was a stranger who came out of the dark and slipped straight back into it. Glasgow's next great horror, though, would come from something far more ordinary and far more absurd. In the 1980s, a war broke out across the city's housing estates over something nobody could ever picture people fighting over, and it would end with an entire family losing their lives in a fire set deliberately in the dead of night. Section 7. The Ice Cream Wars. Some of the cases in this story sound like nightmares. This one sounds like a dark joke, right up until the moment it stops being funny. Because the worst single loss of life Glasgow had ever seen at the time did not come from a feud over anything you might expect. It came from a fight over ice cream vans. In the early 1980s, ice cream vans were big business in Glasgow's housing estates. With shops few and far between in some of these areas, the vans that drove around the schemes had a captive market, and the good routes were worth a serious amount of money. Some of the vans were also used to move other, more illegal goods on the side, which made the money even better and the competition even nastier. Before long, the people who controlled the routes were not simply sellers, they were hard men, and the fight to own the best streets turned dangerous. This became known, almost mockingly, as the Ice Cream Wars. Rival operators threatened each other, smashed windows, and tried to scare drivers off their patch. The police were criticised for failing to get a grip on it, and the trouble kept escalating. One young driver, an 18-year-old named Andrew Doyle, refused to be pushed off his route no matter how much pressure was put on him. His van had already been attacked once. the intimidation did not stop. Then, in the early hours of the 16th of April 1984, it turned into something unforgivable. The door of the Doyle family's top-floor flat in the Ruchesy area was deliberately set alight while the family slept inside. The fire spread fast through the flat. 6 members of the Doyle family lost their lives, including Andrew, the young driver who had stood his ground. Among the others to lose their lives was an 18-month-old baby named Mark. It was, at that point, the greatest single loss of life in a crime in Scotland's history, and the whole country was horrified. The pressure to find those responsible was immense. Within days, an underworld figure named William Love came forward and gave the police information. That information led to a string of arrests, and eventually 2 men, Thomas Campbell and Joe Steele, were charged with causing the deaths of the Doyle family. Both were convicted and sentenced to spend at least 20 years behind bars. There was just one enormous problem. The case against them was extremely weak. A great deal of it rested on the word of William Love, and on claims by police officers that the 2 men had said incriminating things, which several different officers somehow remembered almost word for word. Campbell and Steele insisted from the very first day that they were innocent. And once again, as had happened to Oscar Slater decades earlier, Glasgow had locked up men on shaky evidence and called the case closed. But Campbell and Steele would not go quietly. What followed was one of the longest and most determined fights for freedom in British legal history. The 2 men staged hunger strikes. Steele escaped from prison more than once to force the case back into the headlines. Lawyers, writers, and campaigners on the outside kept pushing year after year. In 1996, both men were released while their case was looked at again, only for that appeal to fail, sending them straight back inside. The breakthrough came from an unexpected place. Experts in psychology studied the kind of evidence that had been used to convict them and proved something simple but powerful. People are not actually able to remember a long-spoken statement word for word, the way the officers in the original trial had claimed to. That, combined with the work of a body set up to review possible miscarriages of justice, finally cracked the case open. In March of 2004, after 20 years of fighting, the appeal court quashed the convictions of Thomas Campbell and Joe Steele. Scotland's most senior judge ruled that the 2 men had been the victims of a serious miscarriage of justice. When Campbell walked free, there was no celebration in his voice. He pointed out that there were only losers in the whole affair. The Doyle family had lost 6 of their own, he and Steele had lost 20 years of their lives, and the truth, he said, had been lost along with everything else. That last point is the one that still hangs over the case. If Campbell and Steele did not set that fire, then who did? 2 decades after the convictions were thrown out, nobody else has ever been found responsible. The people who set that fire that night have, as far as the law is concerned, never been named. The deaths of 6 people, including a baby, sit completely unanswered to this day. The ice cream wars showed how far some people would go for money and territory. 20 years later, Glasgow would witness something with no money behind it at all, and somehow that made it even harder to understand. A 15-year-old boy would be taken off the street in the middle of the day for no reason other than the colour of his skin, in a case that forced the whole of Scotland to face a kind of hatred it had quietly told itself did not exist there. Section 8. The Boy on Kenmure Street. Most of the cases in this story have a twisted kind of logic to them. Money, power, a disturbed mind. What happened to Chris Donald has none of that, and that is exactly what makes it so hard to take. He was a 15-year-old boy who did nothing wrong, who knew none of the people who would end his life, and who was chosen for one reason only: the colour of his skin. Chris was born in 1988 and grew up in the Pollokshields area on the south side of Glasgow. He was an ordinary teenager. He had no part in any gang, no history of trouble, and no link to any feud. On the 15th of March 2004, he was simply out walking along Kenmure Street with a friend in the middle of the day when a car pulled up and his life was taken from him. The reason behind it had nothing to do with Chris at all. The night before, a man named Imran Shahid, who led a local gang of men of Pakistani origin, had been involved in a fight outside a Glasgow nightclub and had come off worse. He wanted revenge. When the gang could not find the people actually responsible, they made a cold and senseless decision instead. They would grab the first young white man they came across and make him pay for something he had no idea about. Chris Donald happened to be on that street at that moment, and that was the only reason he was taken. What followed was a long and terrifying ordeal. Chris was forced into the car and driven for hours on a journey that covered a huge distance across Scotland, all the way up to Dundee and back. He was completely at the mercy of a group of grown men who had decided he was going to suffer for the colour of his skin. By the end of that night, in the East End of Glasgow, Chris Donald had lost his life in a brutal attack. He was 15 years old. The crime sent shockwaves through the city, and the search that followed was unusual for a reason that made the case even bigger. Several of the men involved did not stay in Scotland to face what they had done. They left the country and travelled to Pakistan, putting themselves beyond the easy reach of Scottish police. For a while, it looked as though some of them might never be brought back. That they were brought back at all is largely down to one man. Mohammed Salwar, a Glasgow Member of Parliament, travelled to Pakistan and worked through a tangle of politics and legal barriers to push for the men to be returned to Scotland. It was dangerous work, and he received threats for his efforts. But it paid off, and the men who had fled were eventually arrested abroad and sent back to stand trial. The legal story unfolded in stages. The first man, Danish Saheed, was convicted in 2004, and that conviction made history. It was the first time anyone in Scotland had ever been found guilty of a killing driven by race. 2 years later, in 2006, the others stood trial. Imran Shahid, his brother Zishan Shahid, and a man named Mohammed Faisal Mushtaq were all found guilty. A fifth man, who had helped on the night but had not gone as far as the others, admitted his lesser part and gave evidence against the rest. The sentences reflected how serious the crime was. Imran Shahid, named as the ringleader, was ordered to serve at least 25 years before he could even be considered for release. The others received long sentences of their own. The judge did not hold back in describing what had been done. He made it clear that Chris had been targeted at random purely because he was white, and he condemned the crime in the strongest possible terms. What makes this case stand apart from so many others in Glasgow's history is that, in the end, the people responsible were caught and made to answer for it. There was no mystery left hanging, no wrong man locked up, no one who vanished into the dark. Compared with the unsolved cases and the miscarriages of justice we have already looked at, the law here did its job, even when that meant chasing suspects across the world to do it. And yet the case also carries a quieter, harder lesson. For years, Scotland had been able to tell itself that this kind of hatred was someone else's problem, something that happened in other places. What happened to Chris Donald made that comforting story impossible to believe any longer. A child had been taken off a Glasgow street in broad daylight and made to suffer for nothing more than how he looked, and the whole country had to sit with what that meant. Chris Donald should have grown up, grown old, and been forgotten by history in the best possible way, as just another ordinary man who lived a quiet life. Instead, his name is remembered for the worst day imaginable, and for forcing a city to look honestly at itself. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. The men who took Chris were caught, and Scotland made legal history bringing them to justice. But 2 years later, a quiet and helpful handyman would be working away inside a Glasgow church, trusted by everyone who passed him in its corridors. Not one of them knew that the polite older man fixing the doors and painting the walls had spent years hiding who he truly was and what he had already done. Section 9. The Handyman. In the autumn of 2006, a quiet, helpful, odd-job man was working at St Patrick's Roman Catholic Church in the Anderston area of Glasgow. He fixed things, painted walls, and did the small jobs that keep an old building running. He gave his name as Pat McLaughlin, and nobody at the church had any reason to doubt him. The church welcomed people who were struggling and asked very few questions, which was exactly the kind of place a man with a great deal to hide could slip into unnoticed. His real name was Peter Tobin, and he was one of the most dangerous people Scotland has ever produced. Tobin was originally a Glasgow man, but by 2006 he was supposed to be keeping the police informed of where he lived because of serious crimes he had already committed, including offences against young girls. Instead, the year before, he had simply stopped reporting and dropped out of sight. He changed his name, drifted, and ended up at the church, trusted by everyone around him, while the authorities had no idea where he was. Also staying at St Patrick's was a young woman named Angelika Kluk. She was 23, a languages student from Gdansk in Poland, who had come to Scotland on a working holiday to improve her English and earn some money. The church had helped her before, and now she was living there and lending a hand around the place. She sometimes helped the handyman with his jobs, and he even referred to her as his little apprentice. To anyone watching, it looked completely ordinary. On the 24th of September 2006, Angelika was last seen with the man she knew as Pat near the garage attached to the church as the two of them got ready to do some work. After that, she vanished. Her family and friends raised the alarm and a search began for the missing student. What the police eventually found turned the case from a missing person inquiry into something far darker. Hidden beneath a small hatch in the floor of the church itself was Angelika Kluk. The man who called himself Pat McLaughlin was nowhere to be seen. By then, Tobin had already fled south to London. He did not get far. On the 1st of October, he gave a false name at a London hospital, but a staff member recognised him from a police alert that had gone out, and he was arrested. Within days, he was charged in connection with Angelika's death. The case against him was built on careful forensic work. Investigators went over the church garage and found tiny traces that revealed what had really happened there, even though the scene had been cleaned. Those traces, and the science that followed, tied Tobin to the crime beyond doubt. In May of 2007, he was found guilty at the High Court, and the judge described him in the plainest possible terms as an evil man. He was ordered to serve at least 21 years. For most criminals, that would be the end of the story. For Peter Tobin, it was only the beginning of what investigators uncovered. Experts who studied him did not believe a man like this had harmed only one person, and the police launched a special operation to look back through his life and find out whether he was connected to other unsolved cases. What they found was chilling. After his conviction, officers searched a house in Margate in the south of England, where Tobin had once lived. Buried in the garden were the remains of two teenage girls, Vicky Hamilton and Dinah McNichol, who had both gone missing back in 1991, years before anyone in Glasgow had ever heard the name Pat McLaughlin. Tobin had carried that secret across the country and across more than a decade. He was later found guilty of ending both their lives as well, and he ended up serving 3 separate life sentences. Tobin became the subject of endless speculation. Because he was a Glasgow man who had been active around the right time, some people even wondered whether he could have been Bible John, the man from the Barrowland we looked at earlier. There has never been any proof of that, and it remains nothing more than a rumour. But it shows how deeply the fear of him took hold, and how willing people were to believe he was capable of almost anything. Peter Tobin died in 2022, at the age of 76, while still behind bars. No family member came forward to claim him. He was cremated by the authorities, and his ashes were scattered at sea, leaving nothing behind for anyone to visit or remember. For the families of the women whose lives he took, it was as close to a clean ending as they were ever going to get. What makes Tobin so frightening is not just what he did, but how easily he hid it. He was not a wild-eyed monster that anyone would cross the street to avoid. He was a polite, ordinary-looking older man who could fix your door and chat with you in a corridor, and who used that very ordinariness as a mask. The people of St. Patrick's trusted him completely, and they had no way of knowing what was standing right in front of them. Peter Tobin had spent decades perfecting how to disappear. The final case in this story is almost the opposite in every way. It happened in plain sight, over the course of a single night, and it took the life of a young woman who had only just arrived in Glasgow to build a future for herself. The man responsible was a stranger she had known for no more than a matter of minutes. Section 10. Far from Home. The last case in this story is also the most recent, and in some ways it is the hardest to sit with, because it could have happened to almost anyone. There is no grand villain here with a long history of evil. There is no mystery that took decades to unravel. There is only a bright young woman, a single night out, and a stranger she should never have crossed paths with. Karen Buckley was 24 years old and came from Cork in the south of Ireland. She had trained as a nurse, worked hard, and travelled to build the life she wanted. In early 2015, she moved to Glasgow to study occupational therapy at Glasgow Caledonian University, adding to her skills and chasing a career that would let her help people. By every account, she was warm, ambitious, and full of life. She had only been in the city for a matter of weeks. On the night of the 11th of April 2015, Karen went out with friends to a nightclub called The Sanctuary in Glasgow's West End. It was a normal night out, the kind that thousands of students have every weekend. At some point in the early hours, Karen told her friend she was going to the toilet. She did not come back. She left her jacket behind, and she simply disappeared into the night. What had happened was that, outside the club, Karen had met a young man named Alexander Pacteau. He was 21 years old and, on the surface, gave no sign of being dangerous. He had no real criminal past to speak of. Security cameras in the area captured the two of them talking and then walking together towards his car. Karen, with no reason to suspect anything, appears to have accepted what she thought was simply a lift. She had known him for only a few minutes. Pacteau drove a short distance to a nearby road, and there, in the space of around a quarter of an hour, he attacked her and took her life. There was no argument anyone could ever point to, no motive that made any sense. A young woman who had done nothing but accept a lift was gone, and the man responsible immediately set about trying to hide what he had done. When Karen did not return and could not be reached, alarm spread quickly among her friends and family. Her parents in Ireland were told their daughter was missing. A huge search began across Glasgow, with the police and the public desperate to find her. Some of her belongings turned up in a park, which deepened the fear that something terrible had happened. 4 days after she vanished, the search came to its heartbreaking end when Karen was found at a farm on the edge of the city, where Pacteau had hidden her and tried to cover his tracks. This is where the case becomes very different from the older ones in this story. There were no wrong men arrested, no suspects who slipped away, no decades of doubt. Modern policing did its work fast. The security camera footage placed Pacteau with Karen. Forensic evidence tied him to the crime. The trail led straight to him, and there was simply no way out. Faced with the strength of the case, Alexander Pacteau admitted what he had done. In September of 2015, just months after that terrible night, Pacteau stood in the High Court in Glasgow. He pleaded guilty, and the judge, Lady Ray, did not soften her words. She called it a brutal, senseless attack with no motive behind it, carried out against a defenseless young woman who had simply accepted a lift in his car. She described him as cold and calculating. Pacteau was given a life sentence and told he would have to serve at least 23 years before he could even ask to be released. He would later try to challenge that sentence, then give the attempt up. For Karen's family, No sentence could ever be enough. Her father spoke about the nightmare that every parent fears, the call that tells you your child is never coming home. He described Karen as their angel and made it plain that he wanted the man who took her to spend the rest of his life paying for it. The grief reached far beyond her family. In Ireland and in Scotland, people who had never met Karen were moved by her story, and memorial services were held on both sides of the sea. What stays with people about this case is how ordinary the beginning of it was. Karen Buckley did everything right. She was a sensible, intelligent young woman on a normal night out with friends in a busy city, doing exactly what so many people do without a second thought. She accepted what she believed was a simple, harmless lift, and that one ordinary moment put her in the path of someone willing to do the unthinkable. It is the kind of story that frightens people precisely because there is nothing strange or distant about it. Karen Buckley's case is the most recent in this story, but it carries the same weight as the very first. 10 cases stretched across more than a century and a half, separated by huge gaps of time yet bound together by the same single city. Before we leave them behind, it is worth stepping back from all the details and looking at the bigger picture, at what all of this actually tells us about Glasgow, about justice, and about the way a place chooses to remember its darkest days. If you enjoyed this breakdown, make sure to subscribe. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.